At 5:30 on a bitter December morning, the most feared tank on the battlefield did something no one in a war film ever imagines. It simply stopped. Not from a shell through its armor, not from a broken turret, but because its belly of steel could not find what the machine lived on: fuel. Outside the little village of Hansfeld, a German Tiger shuddered, coughed, and died. Its engine went silent in a world that for months had been running on gasoline, diesel, and a scale of supply that could not be seen from the front lines. A handful of men climbed down from the hull, their breath clouding in the cold, their gloves numb, their boots sinking in snow and oil. They walked toward an impossible sight: neat ranks of olive-drab jerry cans, hundreds of them, stacked like cordwood on the frozen ground. A sergeant counted and wrote the totals. The manifest said 50,000 gallons. For a few stunned minutes, the future narrowed to one image: metal cans, threaded caps glinting in the weak winter sun. In a war where inches often cost lives, a found cache of fuel looked quite literally like salvation. The rumors began then, the kind that moved through soldiers like a fever. Fuel for the Tigers, push to the Meuse, the offensive reborn. Their commander, referred to in the field papers and later recollections as Piper, looked at the stacks and had a choice that would clasp together the small immediate needs of his men and the enormous arithmetic of modern war. There is a cinematic neatness to the moment: man, machine, miracle. But the truth arrived in uglier forms: intercepted paperwork, a captured manifest carried by a quiet corporal, and a newspaper folded against the cold, headline news about pipelines and convoys that made any single stash look puny by comparison. The war, as it had been waged through years of planning and production, had a scale the men at Hansfeld could not change by seizing a heap of cans. Still, choices are not made in newspapers. They're made where men stand with cold fingers and burning hope. If this story pulls you in, and you want the kind of deep dives that follow an artifact to its consequences, subscribe and stay with the piece. To understand why a single tactical decision could ripple into hundreds of altered lives, you have to accept a basic and unromantic fact: modern war is arithmetic. It is not merely steel and bravery, but pipelines and factories, schedules and tonnage. In December 1944, on the Western Front, the arithmetic was ungenerous to Germany. Months earlier, Wehrmacht logistics had been strained for reasons that were structural and systemic: long interdicted supply lines, Allied air superiority that turned trains into targets, and a production apparatus that could not make pace with the appetites of a war being fought across continents. The German army moved forward on hope and ration cards. The Allies moved forward on convoys and industrial output. A captured cache of 50,000 gallons could keep a handful of armored units rolling for a time. It could buy hours, perhaps a day. But the Allies were moving petroleum by the millions. Red Ball Express convoys, hastily organized truck columns, and critical pipeline projects were turning quantities into a new kind of advantage. To the men at Hansfeld, the difference between the two numbers was abstract. To the campaign as a whole, it was decisive. The column that morning had already been consuming more fuel than its formal allotment allowed. Orders issued before the offensive stressed speed and offensive spirit. Use what you must to get to the objective, and those orders became tacit permission to burn reserves. Small delays bled reserves faster than anyone predicted. A blown bridge here, a blocked road there, a pocket of resistance that cost an extra engagement. Each stoppage was not merely a tactical embarrassment, it was a unit of fuel poured down the drain. Traffic compounded the problem. A mechanized column, no matter how disciplined, becomes a long, stubborn snake on any winter road. Tigers in front, half-tracks and supply trucks in the middle, infantry marching in the ruts beside them. A single disabled vehicle halts dozens. Engines idled to warm crews and to power radios. Men shivered, throttled turned, and gallons drained into silence.
The arithmetic of consumption outpaced the arithmetic of supply. Piper had orders that stressed aggression. He was not an ideologue to be romanticized. His was a command responsibility that required decisions under fog and noise. He had men who needed fuel to survive and a front that needed movement to sustain the offensive's momentum. He faced the human calculus: take the cans, push forward, and perhaps gain ground, or leave the cans and risk the column's breath being snuffed slow and cold. That morning at Hansfeld, he made the choice to seize the fuel and press on. There are two ways to tell what followed. One is the local way. The column moved, engines roared briefly, tracks churned through mud and frozen snow, and the men who had dreamed of warmth and motion celebrated in disciplined haste. "We celebrated like winning the lottery," a private later recalled, a short phrase that keeps the memory from turning mawkish, that captures hunger for a small mercy in the vast cruelty of the front. The other way to tell it is strategic. The capture and consumption of those 50,000 gallons did not happen in a vacuum. Elsewhere on the map, the Allies were burying fuel for reasons both strategic and brutal. In towns and depots the size of small cities, pipes and drums of petroleum was set alight rather than risk being used by the enemy. In one emblematic act, engineers ordered the deliberate destruction of massive stocks. Later accounts describe pillars of black smoke that rose like inverted monuments to the calculation that sometimes it is better to lose a resource than to let the foe gain it.
In a single action, the Americans chose to burn fuel that had cost time, labor, and lives to collect. It was an ugly calculus of denial: scorch the earth in order to starve the machine of war that would eat men. Word of such denial moves through a battlefield in the way news did in 1944. Folded clippings, captured orders, an interpreter's translation of the engineer's instructions. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffman, the man who handled captured manifests, kept a small notebook. His pages, later cited in debriefs, show crude arithmetic and signs of confusion, numbers crossed out, columns of cans recorded, asterisks noting origin points. Those asterisks mattered. Men like Hoffman were the human mouths of supply chains. They translated the continent-wide calculus into the gray ink of manifested truth. Piper's choice had immediate tactical rationale. A column that stopped was vulnerable in many ways: to attack, to encirclement, to loss of initiative. To press on was to attempt to keep the enemy reactive rather than decisive. But decisions that save the moment can accelerate disasters later. Fuel taken from one supply pool is fuel not available for the next phase. The company that rejoices now may be hollowed out by the hour. It is worth pausing on why the Allies could make such terrible choices as burning their own fuel. The answer lies not merely in spite, but in strategy. When logistical systems are robust, commanders can make the terrible choices that blunt enemy gains. When a unit can rely on a pipeline or a string of convoys to refill its veins, it can afford to deny stockpiles rather than risk being outflanked by a desperate foe who takes them. The choice to torch millions of gallons in places like Stavelot, Strand variant, Stavelot, was not wanton destruction. It was, as painful as it sounds, deliberate denial, a wartime math problem solved by incineration. For the German regimental commander at Hansfeld, that math was invisible when he looked at the stacked jerry cans. For a few hours, he could convert the abstract into the immediate, the millions into the 50,000. But for every mile his column ate into its tank's fuel lines, the Allies' industrial machine produced advantages the front could not ignore. More trucks, more fuel, more engines pressed forward every day. The American logistical effort had become more than the sum of its parts. It was a daily flood that could wash away local triumphs. Piper's men pushed on. The column threaded its way through a countryside pocked with broken equipment and the ghost tracks of retreat.
Soldiers scavenged what they could from wreckage, repurposing jerry cans, siphoning the remains of engines where possible. The pace was punishing. Every additional mile demanded more from machines designed to carry less in winter than in theory. The farther they advanced, the more fragile their position became.
There is a small detail that historians sometimes miss in focusing on grand strategy, the mundane costs that become moral ones. Fuel scarcity forced choices far beyond movement. Ambulances idled in snow because the trucks had priority. Wounded men were left for hours at the side of the road because the fuel that would have carried them disappeared into the tally for the next push. When vehicles did break down, crews often abandoned them rather than hemorrhage scarce gasoline trying to tow them. Armor that could once have been recovered became hulks in the mud, monuments to a calculus that privileged immediate offensive potential over long-term preservation. The human cost does not always show in official logs. It shows in lines from a diary. We had to leave the radio. We had to leave the boy from the mortar. The command said to move. The road was black with smoke, and we could not stop. It shows in the faces of prisoners, in the stuttering, weary language of survivors who later testified at tribunals about incidents that were in part a fallout from an enforced, frantic momentum. Some of those incidents were war crimes, and wartime deprivation does not excuse atrocity. The Malmedy Massacre, transcript variant Malmedy or Malmadi, historical equivalent Malmedy, would later stand as a grim example of an atrocity tied to the desperate climate of an offensive run on fumes and fear. The connection between logistics and moral collapse is not causal in a simple sense. Bad supply does not cause evil, but pressure magnifies choices, and magnified choices can be monstrous. Commanders above Piper watched the offensive with faces that strained between hope and dread. Field Marshal Walter Model and General Sepp Dietrich, spellings as reported in various field notes, received reports of movement and the localized gains that pillared morale. On paper, the operation looked possible if speed could be maintained. Yet even those names in command were haunted by a more distant arithmetic, the one Albert Speer would later describe in stark terms. The German armaments machine, for all its ingenuity, could not match the Allied production line. Factories produce permanence in war. A captured field depot buys a temporary margin. Reports filtered back about Allied pipeline projects and American truck convoys that seemed unstoppable. The Red Ball Express had not been in the wires like a thunderclap, but rather as a steady, grinding beat. Trucks that did the tedious, dangerous work of hauling gasoline and materiel round the clock. Operation Pluto, the undersea pipeline that moved fuel across the English Channel, was no longer a rumor, but a field fact. The Allies could afford to move oil in ways Germans could not begin to replicate. When Piper's men read a captured paper that morning, they saw in the columns of print the larger truth. The enemy had sources that were not local and could not be starved by taking a single dump of tins.
There were small human contradictions. Captain John Brewster, an American engineer whose after-action notes were blunt, wrote about the decision to destroy a depot at Stavelot. It was better to burn than to risk their fuel in an enemy's hands. The image he recorded, a black pillar against a gray sky, would reappear in countless Allied reports and in the nightmares of those who watched their work become smoke. Captain James Rose, a tank battalion officer, kept a diary entry about the grinding taste of victory when a German column collapsed for lack of gas. The diaries do not gloat, they record the necessary cruelty of strategic denial. Piper's choice to take the cans and keep moving was, by his immediate metric, a success. A column that halted for supply might have been trapped. A column that kept moving could keep the enemy on the defensive. But the calculus of movement is double-edged. Every extra mile the regimental column covered after Hansfeld required fuel that was never meant to stretch that far. The men who cheered in the moment did not yet know how many vehicles would be stripped and abandoned in the days ahead, or how many men would be left without means to evacuate the wounded. They did not yet see columns choked with wreckage an hour from their projected line. And yet, movement matters. In the theory of mechanized war, there is a law of motion logic. Momentum can create opportunities that stationary positions cannot. Piper was not reckless in the cinematic sense of a man seeking glory. He operated within the doctrine of the Wehrmacht at that time, which prized seizing fleeting windows of opportunity. The choice to press on molded itself around that doctrine, but doctrine sits atop logistics. Doctrine does not fill empty tanks. By midday, the column's rhythm had shifted from measured progress to strained motor noise. The tigers and panthers chewed through what they had taken. The stacks of jerry cans were unloaded, siphoned, and distributed into internal tanks and external bladders. Men worked like ants in discipline born of necessity. Every can poured represented a small postponement of calamity, a bought hour. At this point, a different voice appears in the archive. Interviews recorded years later with veterans who had been within a few kilometers of the action. Their memories are precise in the way memory often is for trauma, vivid data points wrapped in fog. One veteran remembered the thawing metallic smell of oil mixed with snow and the hush that followed as engines caught. Another recalled watching a comrade remove his gloves to hand over a cap of fuel to a tank driver, the bare hands showing red against the olive fabric, and how trivial that gesture felt in the infinity of consequences. These small acts of care and theft, of borrowing and sharing, add texture to an otherwise cold logistical story. None of this history permits us to be sentimental about choices that led to suffering.
Piper's decision did alter the lives of hundreds. Some got to push forward and fight another day. Others would later be captured or wounded in actions that the fueled advance precipitated. A chain of cause and effect stretches from his hand to the fate of men who would be buried, imprisoned, or maimed on ground the column never reached. That is the moral center of the story. A command choice made in desperation cascaded into outcomes neither intended nor entirely foreseeable. Yet the scene at Hansfeld also reveals the deeper truth of the campaign. Even well-executed tactical choices can be rendered meaningless by the sheer scale of an opponent's logistics. Piper could steal a fortune in cans, but the enemy's fortune in millions of gallons moved every day. This is not elegance, it is arithmetic that crushes hope in ways that feel personal, because the men who pay the price are flesh and blood. As the column pushed on, orders trickled down from higher echelons, urging economy and care. The same men who had been permitted to burn reserves were now told to conserve what remained. The contradiction was bureaucratic and painfully human. Commanders ask their subordinates to do what the resources allow, but different commanders have different information. Where frontline officers see emptiness and make full-stop decisions, strategic planners behind the lines see the flow and take choices designed for a larger scope. Those information gaps are where tragedies and small triumphs alike are bred. By evening, the men who had gnawed the fortune of jerry cans were exhausted. Their tracks left a dark, lumpy path that would be visible long after their silhouettes melted into the dusk. They had done what was required within their immediate horizon. They had seized possible salvation because their command demanded movement. Yet an undercurrent of unease flowed through the ranks. Captured orders and newspaper scraps circulated, mentioning pipelines and convoys that displaced the meaning of their tiny harvest. The men began to understand, in a way they could not before, that the war was not a matter of fronts alone, but of factories, of ships, of docks, and fuel that came from places no one in their company could reach. When a column such as Piper's moves like a river, its current either finds a sea or drowns itself on the rocks. That evening,
With hands numb and capillaries full of cold, they set up positions, spread the exhausted crews over the uneven ground, and listened to distant artillery that seemed a reminder of a scale beyond their control. The harvested cans were now part of the tally kept for the next day. Men slept fitfully, waking to the sound of distant engines and the whisper that somewhere a depot had been set alight rather than surrendered.
The next morning, the world presented another fact. Newspapers, slightly crumpled in the wind, reported massive burns at Stavelot, where Allied engineers had chosen to deny the enemy stocks that would have been useful on short notice. The photograph circulating among men was of a column of black smoke that rose as if from a pit of some enormous animal. The image reframed the Hansfeld discovery. 50,000 gallons was a fortune at the regimental level. It was a rounding error against the millions being mobilized by the Allied machine. Piper read the reports, or had someone read them to him. The look on his face, written later in accounts, was not triumph or humiliation, but comprehension, the quiet, slow realization that a tactical gain had been dwarfed by an industrial scale he could not change. He had made one choice, the choice the title would later hinge upon, and it had indeed altered the immediate fate of his men. But as the picture of Allied logistical capacity sharpened, the scale of his choice's significance shifted. What had seemed like salvation now looked like an act caught between two magnitudes, human desperation and industrial abundance. There was no cinematic villainy in that moment. There was only the sober realization of limits. The men under Piper's command understood that their engines would grow hungry again, that the next battle might require more than a handful of cans could provide. They also understood that elsewhere a decision had been made to burn fuel rather than risk it. The enemy's willingness to sacrifice resource stockpiles for strategic denial revealed a brutal logic. Better to lose a material asset than to permit it to power a thrust toward critical lines. Piper's orders did not change. He had committed to pressing forward. As his column formed to advance, a small convoy of supply trucks lagged, engines sputtering, their drivers holding maps that showed lines of fuel distribution drawn like veins across a map. The men driving the trucks were young and hollow-eyed. They had been instructed that priority was given to combat elements. The supply drivers cursed under their breath and siphoned where they could. Every siphon and every extra mile they drove complicated an already complicated arithmetic. And out beyond the roads, the strategic picture grew firmer. Allied planners moved fuel along pipelines and in convoys, creating redundancy. The Red Ball Express, for all its improvisation, operated like a nervous system. Operation Pluto under the sea supplied a backbone of oil that made local captures less decisive. The Allies were not simply outproducing Germany in a single factory metric, they were altering the operational environment by making denial an option. If the enemy could replace lost fuel with a constant flow, then local victory by capture could at best be temporary. Piper had made one choice. He had commanded the taking of fuel and the pressing on. The column's forward motion was a human engine whose pistons were men and whose cylinders were filled with hope. That choice changed hundreds of lives in the most immediate ways. Men lived who otherwise might have died in a collapsed column. Others were tasked with risky refueling missions that later left them exposed. Some would be captured in engagements that followed. Others would commit acts under pressure that would be judged as war crimes.
Choices, once made, replanted themselves across timelines. For now, at least, the column moved. Snow spat against the faces of the soldiers, exhaust steamed and carved ghosts into the cold air. The harvested jerry cans, now emptied or partially emptied into tanks, were lashed to vehicles or left where they had been opened. Men checked their belts, their boots, their maps. They were a long thread on a winter road. Ahead lay towns that might be supportive, pockets of resistance, blown bridges. Behind them lay the neat stacks of olive-drab metal that would soon be remembered not as salvation, but as a turning of a page. As they pushed toward their next objective, rumors of the burned depot at Stavelot circulated like a second wind. Conversations that morning shifted from scarce rations and frost-bitten toes to the broader reality. The opponent could afford to be ruthless in denial. In a brutal calculus, the Allies had chosen incineration of resources to prevent any chance of their use by the Germans. That choice, too, would be examined later, not as wanton waste, but as a weapon of strategy. To deny the enemy was to hold a form of power that could stop an offensive without firing a single aimed shot. Piper's mind, so accounts suggest, must have sifted through these flows of information like one mopping up a room after a storm. The local victory at Hansfeld had become a stained triumph. The arithmetic of supply on the continental scale was not visible to a commander staring at jerry cans, but the signs were there. Newspapers, captured manifests, reports of convoys still moving inexorably. Those signs would now press against his next orders, his next decisions, and the lives under his charge. The column that left Hansfeld carried its temporary fortune into a countryside that had suddenly become a ledger. Each mile written across the men would be tallied in minutes and gallons, and eventually in consequences. The choice had been made publicly, in the chatter of men, in the list of supplies, in the movement of tanks. The ripple was now moving outward. The atmosphere hung with an impending sense that a different form of struggle, the battle of supply and denial on a continental scale, was about to impose itself on the tactics of every company and every squad. The scene closes not with a dramatic explosion, but with the measured grinding noise of the column reclaiming its momentum. Engines began to sound like a heartbeat. The men, exhausted and weary, kept their faces set against the cold.
The cans, the decision, and the small miracle of movement were now part of an unfolding sequence, one that would soon meet another human decision made under equal pressure, the order to deny fuel through fire in towns that had no future but smoke. That choice, made elsewhere by engineers and planners, would create an image, a pillar of black smoke that would be burned into many memories. For now, however, Piper's choice had propelled his men forward into a night that promised both the temporary satisfaction of movement and the slow accumulation of peril. The arithmetic that would break the offensive had not yet completed its work. The men moved into the next day with something more than hope, a fragile momentum that would be tested by bridges, by blocked roads, by weather, and by the decisions of other commanders who had different calculators on their desks. The day dwindled, and with it the immediate warmth that 50,000 gallons had provided. The men ate cold rations, patched boots, tightened belts, and read the last available newsprint by the light of a dim lantern. The jerry cans, once stacked like a cathedral of potential, now lay scattered. The realization that their fortune might be an illusion seeped into conversation like cold through fabric. Some men laughed nervously, some stared into nothing. Piper sat apart, folding a map and tracing with a finger the line they had just taken.
The hand that had signed the order to take the cans trembled minutely, as the pressure of command always trembles when the consequences are uncertain. Dawn would bring new orders, new miles, and new choices, but the choice at Hunsfeld had already done its work. It had moved a column, it had altered the immediate fates of hundreds, and it had planted the first link in a chain that would reveal the greater arithmetic of the campaign. The soldiers slept, knowing that they had done what was expected, proud and terrified in equal measure. The scene closes on a landscape of half-light and iron, and on the knowledge that larger machines, factories, pipelines, convoys were grinding in a tempo no single village could control. The smoke from Stavelot did not climb like the thin wisp of a single fire. It stacked, thick and obscene, into the gray December sky, a black column that could be seen for miles. Engineers had ringed the depot with fuel drums and stacked pallets of cans the size of houses. When the order came to burn, the countryside answered with an inferno that turned day into char. Men watched in cold, some with relief, some with sorrow, as mountains of petroleum became a weapon of denial. Everything reduced to flame so that nothing might feed the enemy's engines. That pillar of smoke reframed everything. For the soldiers who still smelled diesel on their uniforms, for the commanders whose maps had been inked with lines of attack, it was evidence of a brutal arithmetic.
50,000 gallons at Hansfeld had been a godsend at the regimental level. 2 million in a depot was a strategic cache that could be replaced day after day only because somewhere behind the lines a prodigious industrial system fed the battlefield. The Americans burning Stavelot were not indulging wastefulness. They were practicing a form of warfare in which destruction could serve as an instrument of victory. To deny fuel was to reduce the enemy's options without firing a shot at his tanks. Piper saw that column of smoke as if it were a verdict. In his mind, the stacked jerry cans at Hansfeld, once a narrow miracle, shrank against a new scale. He had made one tangible choice: to take, to fuel, to push, and that decision now existed beside another choice, executed by others, that sought to make such local seizures strategically impotent. His choice had altered the immediate fortunes of his men. Some were warm that night who would have been cold. Some engines that might otherwise have quit limped a little farther down the road. But the wider campaign was governed by flows, pipelines under the channel, convoys that ate the clock and returned again for more, factories that coughed out tanks and trucks in numbers Germany could not match. The days that followed were a ledger of attrition in both steel and flesh. As the column advanced, the roads became galleries of abandoned machinery. Tanks sat nose down in ditches, turrets ajar, their radios cold. Half-tracks leaned like wounded animals, their tracks torn, their engines gutted by a shortage of spare parts and fuel. When recovery units arrived later, many vehicles were simply beyond salvage. Crews had chosen to destroy or leave them rather than expend the dwindling gasoline they had left. The landscape filled with hulks, monuments to an arithmetic that had been ignored or misunderstood in the heat of the moment. The human consequences accumulated with dreadful predictability. Ambulances without fuel were stationary coffins and deferred mercy. Wounded men waited at the side of the road, while supply trucks, prioritized for tanks and combat vehicles, thundered past. In letters smuggled home or read in post-war interviews, soldiers described the horror of watching comrades lie uncomforted for hours because no fuel remained to move them to care. The decision to press on, to keep engines turning at all cost, turned simple logistics into moral choices. Whose life would be sacrificed for momentum, and who would be left behind because the next jerrycan might be needed to reach a position that might burst through enemy lines.
Deprivation does not create criminal intent, but it warps judgment and magnifies violent impulses. Reports and survivor testimonies later linked a climate of fear, exhaustion, and frantic movement to a series of brutal acts. The tribunal records, depositions, and historical inquiries left no ambiguity. Men were murdered, commanders bore responsibility, and justice struggled to catch up in the wreckage of war. Such events must be stated plainly. These were crimes, prosecuted where possible, and remembered without euphemism. The operational effects were plain as well. Tanks immobilized for lack of fuel became targets and, if left, resources for the enemy. Repair crews had nothing to work with. Fuel rationing meant that recovery operations were delayed until the moment for salvaging had passed. A single disabled vehicle could stop a column for hours, sometimes long enough for enemy forces to reorganize or to strike. The tempo Piper had tried to maintain, the momentum doctrine that undergirded the push, requires a logistics tail that is both deep and reliable. Where that tail was thin, momentum became a liability. Movement created new needs faster than they could be supplied, and every extra mile demanded choices that increased danger for the men driving them. Beyond the immediate battlefield, the picture of industrial mismatch sharpened. Albert Speer, who later reflected soberly about Germany's armaments production, argued that shortages were not merely tactical, but structural. Factories could be destroyed, schedules disrupted, and labor reallocated, but Germany's capacity to replace losses and to maintain long supply lines simply could not match that of the Allies. The United States, with its vast continental industry and merchant fleets, moved materiel in numbers that rendered local captures minor in scale. Where a regimental commander could find 50,000 gallons in a field and celebrate, Allied systems were shifting millions of gallons in and out of theater, enough so that the strategic calculus favored denial over conservation in some contexts. Those Allied systems were not mystical, they were logistical. The Red Ball Express, a ragged but relentless network of truck convoys, threaded routes to supply frontline units round the clock. Drivers labored in whiteouts and under shell fire, hauling the heavy, dirty work of feeding mechanized armies. Operation Pluto, the pipeline that ran under the channel, delivered crude and refined fuels in ways that made local depots less decisive. The combination of undersea pipes, forward storage, and convoys meant that Allied commanders could accept harsh, destructive measures like the burning of Stavelot because they had alternative flows to sustain their forces. To the German frontline soldier, this was the unseen advantage that slow-moving bulletins or a single newspaper headline could not fully convey. The psychological impact of that invisible machine was devastating.
Men who believed that battlefield daring or local genius could alter the course of an offensive found themselves up against an opponent who had made the deliberate choice to make logistics a weapon. The burning of fuel depots was demoralizing because it turned a potential boon into ash in front of their eyes. The image of black smoke was not just a tactical moment, it was a symbol of power. The power to choose denial as a strategy and the material base to accept immediate losses for long-term gain. Piper's column continued to fight and to suffer. Skirmishes flared over bridges and crossroads, a grenade thrown into a choke point, a minefield detonating under track and tread. Each small event consumed fuel at the worst possible rate as engines idled, towed, and tried to claw out of mud or snow. Men scavenged for anything that could be burned to make an engine turn, bits of wooden crate, a smear of oil from a wreck, stolen rations. Desperation turns ingenuity into moral gray. Siphoning fuel from a civilian truck was survival for some. Commandeering a village's supply could condemn its inhabitants later. These micro-decisions were human and messy, not neat points on a map.
The cascading loss of mobility began to remit the offensive's momentum. Where once columns could fan and exploit a breakthrough, now they queued, choked, and became prey to counterattacks. Commanders found themselves throttled by the numbers on a manifest. What had been a doctrine of motion became a chronicle of stops. The promise of a bold thrust to the Meuse dissolved in a series of tactical retrenchments. Strategic planners who had hoped for a different tempo watched as what had been a plausible operation in abstract became on the ground a grinding series of compromises. Accountability surfaced in different forms. Some decisions were taken in good faith within the fog of war, others were criminally malicious. Where atrocities occurred, investigations followed. The Malmedy trials exemplify how post-war institutions sought to reckon with crimes that had been committed under the stress of conflict. Some perpetrators were convicted and punished, others eluded full justice. The legal proceedings could not restore lives or erase the harm, but they created a record. That record placed certain events in the moral category they belonged to, not incidental byproducts of a desperate offensive, but crimes that required condemnation and redress. Amid the rubble of command and the litany of failures, the larger arithmetic of industrial capacity was unavoidable. Factories in the United States were producing engines and tanks, trucks and fuel with a scale and redundancy that the Wehrmacht could not mirror. Where German industry had been remarkable for ingenuity and adaptation, it was nonetheless outmatched by the resources marshaled on the Allied side: raw materials, factory lines, and a labor force mobilized on a scale that allowed replacement and expansion even amid Allied bombing. The practical effect was simple and merciless. The Allies could absorb losses and continue to supply forces forward. German formations could not. That imbalance showed itself in everyday items: tires, spare parts, radio tubes, and, crucially, fuel. The Allied ability to keep the gas flowing transformed the operational playbook. Denial became a viable tool precisely because the Allies could live with immediate losses. Their supply lines could be refed. The Germans, without such redundancy, found every capture temporary and every abandonment permanent. The arithmetic of supply, gallons moved, trucks rolling, pipeline throughput, became the decisive measure of endurance and reach. As the offensive faded, the toll was counted in men and machines. Units were reduced, brigades bled out, and entire formations found themselves less capable than their records suggested. Soldiers who had cheered at Hansfeld now sat in shells of vehicles, writing notes to be delivered if they should fall, or simply staring up the snow and the absence of sound. Prisoners were taken, and their testimony would later fill archives. Some prisoners recounted being marched in desperation. Others spoke of being left without food or cover. The human stories were not abstractions. They were faces, names, letters home, and the atoms of grief that would long outlive the war. In the years after the conflict, artifacts of the offensive traveled into memory and into display. Museums would later present a Tiger tank behind glass, a black plaque noting its model, and a small, curious detail: the gauge at 0. Visitors often paused there, fingers tracing the case, as if to connect with the machine's history. The empty gauge served as a silent, potent metaphor: a mightiest engine, fuel-starved, halted. An image that reframed romantic ideas of invincibility into the practical reality that even the most feared weapon is vulnerable to the lack of a simple fluid. Veterans met in reunion halls and town squares, and in those conversations the memory of Hansfeld and Stavelot took on new hues. American drivers who labored on convoys spoke openly about cold nights and the danger of their routes. German survivors spoke about the taste of frozen breath and the grotesque feeling of watching black smoke from depots while their own trucks coughed empty. In some of those meetings, former foes shared a sober recognition. On both sides, ordinary men had borne the burden of decisions made by others. That shared recognition did not excuse crimes or lessen culpability. It complicated the narrative with a human dimension, revealing how logistical structures subsumed individual choices. Piper himself survived the war. He was captured as the campaign finally stalled and the German front receded. After hostilities ceased, he, like many officers, faced the terrible aftermath, debriefings, prison camps, and eventually the slow return to civilian life.
The record of his post-war years is not one of justification, but of reflection. Accounts suggest he lived quietly, less a figure of defiance than a man with visible marks of command. The small tremor of a hand that had once signed orders, the long silences when asked to recount the campaign. He did not become a public apologist for what had been done. He lived with the knowledge that one decision in a cold morning at Hansfeld had bent the paths of hundreds. History must avoid sentimentalizing such figures. Piper's choice was tactical, human, and consequential. It saved some, condemned others inadvertently, and plugged a specific need into a larger, unforgiving equation. To focus on him alone would be to overlook the many choices at depots, in factories, on convoys, that together composed the architecture of victory and defeat. But it is precisely because a single hand can be seen in a single moment that the story has its power. The human hinge becomes a lens through which we view the consequences of systems. If there is a central lesson, it is not a simplistic moral nor a neat parable. It is a complex truth. Modern war privileges logistics in a way earlier conflicts did not. Gallantry and bravery are always crucial, but they are rarely decisive in isolation. The ability to move, to supply, and to deny resources is strategic power concentrated into everyday mechanics, pipelines, trucks, warehouses. Piper's cans were a vivid, human-scale symbol of this reality, a local miracle that could not, on its own, overturn a continent's production and distribution apparatus. The burning at Stavelot remains an image that historians return to precisely because it condenses this lesson. It shows the terrible calculus of modern military strategy, in which destruction can be a means to victory, and in which abundance allows commanders to make choices that shape outcomes without firing a single targeted shot. It also shows the moral cost. Depots ignited meant landscapes ravaged, civilian concerns sidelined, and long-term consequences for those who lived near the conflagrations. Strategically prudent? In many cases, yes. Morally unambiguous? Never. In the quiet years that followed, historians sifted through manifests and diaries, through the testimony of truck drivers and the memoirs of planners. The arithmetic of supply became a subject not just of military study, but of national introspection. How do nations mobilize not just soldiers, but the engines that sustain them? How are decisions made that ask for sacrifice in one metric while promising gain in another? These questions, born of the bitter experience at Hansfeld and Stavelot, would inform doctrine for generations. The artifacts remain. A tiger in a museum waits beneath a light that picks out its rivets. A plaque notes its service at a front now long silent. A faded photograph of a Stavelot inferno circulates among archives, its blackness still able to arrest the gaze. The stacks of jerry cans, once ordinary tin and paint, are rendered symbolic in the collective memory. They represent both desperation and the practical limits of tactical action. The closing image is necessary and simple. Imagine the commander standing, fingers numb, map folded against his chest. He had made one choice that day, to seize fuel and order motion, and that action had rippled outward in ways he could not fully foresee. Man lived and died as a result. Machines were abandoned. Atrocities were committed in a climate of fear that logistics exacerbated, although never excused. Across the sea and under it, the enemy's pipelines and truck columns rolled on, indifferent to the drama of a single village. Industrial capacity, not heroism alone, had in this operation become the decisive force. The lesson is not a glorification of machines over men, nor a dismissal of individual courage. It is a recognition that in modern war, arithmetic shapes fate as surely as bullets. Piper's choice stands not as cause of the war's outcome, but as the human hinge in a moment where individual decision met systemic reality. The lives altered by that hinge, hundreds of them, remind us that strategy translates into flesh and that the consequences of command are measured in human terms. If this account moved you and you want to explore more stories where logistics meet battlefield drama, please like, subscribe, and check the links for a companion deep dive on fuel, convoys, and the industrial underpinnings of modern warfare.